Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host Chris Shang. Today we have a guest, Christophe Foulon, who is a cybersecurity expert. He's been in this space for over a better part of a decade and plus, and has a lot to share with what's been going on and where we are seeing things going and progressing in the future, especially with a lot of these different types of hot topics like AI. Christophe, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. Wow, about myself. Well, I started in tech and cyber over 17 years ago when I lived in the Caribbean and loved it ever since. I would say I spent the better part of my earlier career trying to transition into security because back then there wasn't security titles. And I almost had to move up to the DC area about 7 years ago to get my first security title. But
Wow.
yeah, I've been doing it in help desk, been doing it in infrastructure, and now I get to work with MSSPs, and I've also had the opportunity to work in small and large organizations.
Very cool. Um, Walk us, I guess, like talk us through what your initial interest and what led you into security, especially in the early days before it became more of a known quantity. As you mentioned, it was somewhat of an endeavor to get into it. So what drew you into it in the first place?
Well, the story goes back to one of my first days in a help desk role where I was helping someone out, and long and behold, on their keyboard, they had a post-it note with their username and password on there for everyone to see. And the first thing that came to my mind was there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
And back then, password managers weren't very popular. There were some that only lived on mobile devices, but if your device crashed, that was the only copy of it. So it was hard to get users to adopt that. So I found different ways to get them to act in a safer manner when it comes to username and passwords. But that's kind of what drew me into it. I long tinkered with enabling different business users to use technology in a safe way, but the post a note on the password was the first thing that really drew me into security, thinking there's got to be a safer way to do this.
Yeah. I remember that. I mean, yeah, that's probably like just not even, probably just over a decade ago where it was not yet commonplace to have a lot of these authentication processes, right? And so, I mean, you've seen that grow, I would say, probably the past 3 or 4 years. What do you think has kind of matured in that space of security? Um, I think there's a few different layers. So maybe you want to explain the different layers, right? So like there's a user layer, and then there's also like the different layer that has to be involved from a company standpoint, from a business perspective, and also the protection of their users. Um, but walk us through kind of like the different touches that security covers.
Yeah, so let's start with where most people think of security, and that's within the corporation. So there's an enabling safe processes through either confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And in the organization, you have applications, databases, infrastructure, and all of it has different layers of security, authentication, integrity built into it. And that's the back end that most people don't think about. Then there's the front end that a lot of consumers interact with. And when it comes to security there, I think the larger tech companies, the larger financial institutions have really helped move that forward. There's still a lot of work to be done from the smaller institutions because when it comes to them moving up, say, multi-factor authentication, the cost versus what they see as potential revenue, it it doesn't add up for them. So they're still lacking in that, and unfortunately will likely always lack into it until compliance forces them to move forward.
Yep.
And I hate to mention security and compliance in the same phrase, but I say compliance sets the minimum standards, but it should never be the maximum thresholds for any company to try to strive for.
Yep. Absolutely. Uh, you kind of mentioned like these different facets that security touches and oversees. Um, I think obviously you brought it up. It's when I think of security, I think a lot of people think of like these are defenses, right? From people or bad players out there that are trying to do X, Y, and Z. What are some of those things that you've seen in your experience where some of these bad players, what are they trying to get a hold of, or what are some of these use cases of where security is super important or super critical? And I'm sure that there's a lot of different use cases, but kind of maybe like the top 3 to 5 that you typically see.
Well, they typically all revolve around the threat actors making money.
Yeah,
And that usually means either selling information, selling access to infrastructure, or selling some sort of item which they can receive reward for. So that could be travelers' points, that could be cloud infrastructure that you're paying for, but someone else is getting access to your own infrastructure that you've paid for and someone else is getting access to, or IP for your company or your customers' private information, healthcare information, financial information, things like that.
yeah. Um, Interesting. And so you mentioned that you've had a pretty wide breadth of scope of work from smaller companies to obviously enterprise scale companies. When you first kind of come in, is there a very like clear understanding of what the scope of work looks like, or are you like personally going through some kind of audit, or is there like a more formal audit from a team perspective that you guys are doing in the very beginning when you come in, and then figure out how to prioritize where to emphasize, uh, you know, resources from a security standpoint and going through that in an organized way? Is there a process to that? Walk us through kind of your thinking.
Yeah, there should always be a process to that because to the organization, most of the times, if it's not done right, security is looked at as an expense.
Yeah.
When it's done correctly, it is looked at as a business enabler. So if you could work with the business to understand what sort of projects it's going to be working on, what sort of things drive its revenue, then work around securing those processes because it could be that if they lose the ability to service their customers or um, provide a website to access and you're losing $1 million a day,
Yeah.
hopefully your security will cost less than that.
Yeah.
So they will see that as a insurance, as a backup for keeping their services available. Now, if your security cost is going to be more than the business is um, receiving from that service, they're going to push back and say, well, we can't afford this. So I would always recommend working with your business leaders to see what's generating revenue for the organization, and then what can you do to ensure that that continuously generates revenue, that it generates revenue in a safe and secure way, and that it's always available for them to generate revenue from.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it where it's, a lot of these smaller companies don't worry or not worry, but they don't feel like it's worth the investment until it's a compliance issue where typically like that compliance is then allowing them to move up market. And because the larger companies that they choose to work with in that more upmarket motion requires some level of compliance. So like again, you mentioned, those being the basic minimum requirements that it should be looked at for security. But I think that's how a lot of people start moving or maturing into that security level is when they realize it's prohibiting them from entering a certain size of market. Um, and
Yeah, I was going to say, well, more and more you're finding to move up market, not only are you needing compliance, but you're needing security.
yeah,
So I've worked with recently some healthcare companies that, in order to sign the contract with their next large payer or their next large vendor, they're doing a security assessment. And as part of that assessment, these companies are seeing, well, they might not be as mature as they wanted them to be from a security posture point of view. So you're having to improve their maturity in order to gain a client.
yeah,
Sometimes companies say, oh, well, we'll get a SOC 2 and I'll solve everything. That it doesn't. It gives you a stamp that at that point in time, the auditor that came in said, yes, you're doing these things, but it's in no way a representation of continuous security.
yeah. Uh, can you, we have a lot of, I'm sure, like you know, founders that are at that stage of like Series A, Series B, where they're definitely in that position of, you know, holding these certifications for the sake of gaining that new business. But you talked about sustainable security essentially, and can you walk us through what that means to some of these founders that might be listening in, and how that might be prohibitive if they're just looking at the basic certifications and compliance, how that's going to prohibit them in the longer term from perhaps like retention perspective, but also continue to then um, I think you run into continuous roadblocks with every single new customer potentially based on what their security requirements are. And so you're going to have to do this back and forth and back and forth to try to constantly up your security level. But yeah, can you walk us through what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, well, let's think of an analogy. If you're building a house and you wanted to have a security system installed and it be invisible from anyone that enters your house to visit you, the cheapest way to do that is to do it when you're building the house.
Yeah,
So putting the wiring in the back end, doing everything and the sensors in the back end, everything like that when you're building it, then it's seamless, it works. You don't have to worry about tacking it on, breaking down the drywall, repainting, everything like that if you were to try to do it after the fact.
yeah,
It's a similar analogy when you're adding security onto an application after it's in production. You're going to have to rewrite code, you're going to have to add on things that might break functionality that you already have that wasn't doing it securely or safely in the first place, but it was just running because you were running fast and you didn't think of security in the beginning. If, for example, now when you're a founder, you include multi-factor authentication, you include encryption of the database from the beginning, from your architecture, then you don't have to worry about that going down the pipeline. Um, Similar for adding resiliency. Um, you can't just automatically replicate your application if it's not built to be a replicatable application. So
yeah,
you could put it in two different parts of the cloud. That doesn't mean that they'll automatically fail over. It just means that you have the same copy two places. Now you have to worry about sending data back and forth, and you have to worry about, is one zone less populated with data than the other zone? And is the information right across the two zones as you make changes? So, from an integrity standpoint, is your data even what it's supposed to be? And how do you know which copy is right? So, all these things, if they think about it from the beginning, then they can build onto it as they grow and scale with less friction than trying to add it on at the end.
yeah, absolutely. I'm curious as to I mean, you gave a very clear and rational explanation for how to think about it and why to think about it early. From your experience, how many like with the companies that you've worked with or advised, how many of them have thought about it like as part of building the infrastructure of the house versus you're kind of doing this retroactive like technical debt to kind of get it up to where it needs to be. I'm sure like the general landscape probably is most don't tend to add it into part of their infrastructure, but I
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. The less technical companies that say aren't in fintech or aren't in technology don't think of that as they're building out their business. They'll get a website and they'll populate it. They'll get a vendor to do the back end, but they won't think about security until something happens,
yeah,
and then they're spending their time fixing it. Or some of the more tech forward companies, they might have a venture capital backer that will recommend from the beginning that they start to think about it, or they think about it themselves because they've had an incident where their data has been breached from another company and they don't want that to happen to their customers.
got it. Um, Interesting. So I kind of want to talk about too, like some of the evolutions in the security space. I mean, I'm thinking about it as a non-technical founder myself, and for coming from a non-technical perspective, I can only remember kind of going through what how the market has evolved from an end user perspective. And I think like yes, the from a user point of view, authentication has gotten progressively, especially across like fintech space, healthcare space. I would say very consciously, I've noticed that evolution in the past 2 years change a lot, where you have different types of tools and new applications that I didn't see before that. Um, what I mean, you being in the weeds of it, what has kind of like sparked that change, or has there been like you know different uh legal actions, requirements, um, by governments. And I think like also the way things are done in the US is very different from how it's done in Europe and things like that. How do you start thinking about, I guess, first question is like, how has things evolved, I guess, in the past couple of years around the topic of security? And do you think it's evolved a lot more quickly in the past couple of years than it has previously? I know you've been in this for nearly 2 decades, but like, has it evolved a lot more rapidly, or is it pretty much on pace with what and people are just more seeing it at a mass scale?
I would say yes, it has evolved more rapidly because of the decrease in cost.
Right.
So cost is passed on to the customer. So the more expensive it is for you as a founder to get single sign-on or to get an MFA service available for yourself, much less your customers, the less it's going to cost for you to deploy it. So yes, as the cost of these technologies has decreased, you've seen wider adoption of it. I and then the other aspect is with regards to compliance. So, like you mentioned, in the U.S. as trailing behind, say, Europe. Europe's had MFA in their bank cards since going back to the 90s. They actually used to give their customers RSA tokens just to do online PIN transactions back in the late 90s. So the fact that the states couldn't do it was more so a factor that they weren't being forced to do it. They didn't have any regulatory reasons to do it, or their customers weren't demanding it.
Yeah.
Now, as customers start to demand it from a privacy perspective, now you start to see the privacy aspect driving the security aspects,
Yeah.
because customers don't want their data breached. And when it is in a very sensitive area like financial or healthcare, then you see them more so driving with their money than driving with anything else. So you have back end providers trying to catch up for that.
Yeah.
in retail space, in non transactional spaces, you see that still dragging behind because there's no motive for them to push yet.
Yeah. I have a few questions here, but one would be why and this may be a stupid question, but why do you think that the US is so behind, has historically been so behind like, for example, EU in terms of setting regulations? And I bring that up only because like the next topic of thinking about AI, like we're much more looser here with what those restrictions are than it is in the EU, and obviously that can have bigger implications, privacy just only being one of them. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say look back to the beginning of World War II. You have um, a German leader that then uses his access to information to persecute those against them. So that sets a cultural perspective that drives privacy, that drives security. Whereas here in the States, that was it happened a little bit in the 40s, but didn't happen to the scale that it did in Europe. So it quickly lost interest here in the US until you had regulatory reasons to do so.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, that makes a ton of
Uh,
sense.
yeah, and similar for that data protection for AI, it's looser here because up until, say, for example, Cambridge Analytica, there wasn't a lot of controls put around selling of personal data, collecting of personal data, and there now you have um, a setting that was raised up to governmental levels where people were pushing back. Now they start to ask to protect the data. Now they start to see how having less controls over private information drove tech companies to use psychological manipulation in their marketing techniques, in their product design. And then you start to see Congress pushing back. I would say the fact that Congress has acted so quickly with regards to AI once it became quote unquote publicly available, because there was a lot of machine learning, a lot of artificial intelligence used behind the scenes. But once it became publicly available and publicly seen what could be done with it, then they started to act a lot quicker in scale than, say, previous security breaches or information exposures in the past.
Interesting. One of the listeners just brought up the fact that, in their opinion, that the U.S. is ahead of the EU in terms of innovation. Do you think that you need these looser restrictions in order for innovation to happen, and that allows for it to happen, or or is that a moot point?
I would sure less regulations could drive innovation, but for example, innovation in the ability to do secure financial transactions was actually driven from the EU. They were the first ones to develop chip multi-factor authentication when it comes to that on credit cards. Um, in the States, they're still allowing credit cards to be used without a PIN, with just a signature, even though there is a chip on there. In Europe, they don't do that anymore. You have to use your chip, a PIN, just to verify that you have physical access to that credit card and it's less susceptible to being manipulated.
Interesting. Um, a couple more topics, and we're about to hit up on time, but a couple more topics, if you don't mind. But number one is I mean, we talked about security, and privacy as it relates back to privacy. You've seen, especially in like the past couple of years, these accepting of the cookies, right? Like, And obviously that's a lot of it stemmed from like the Cambridge Analytica from that experience, and people being more from a consumer level, I think, aware of their privacy being taken. I still don't think though that there's a mass understanding, like unless you're in tech or like you're on the security side of things, and even like not even deep tech, like just, you know, the majority of the population is not involved in that. And I think about my family members, right? Like they don't know what those things are that they're choosing to opt into yet. And there's the very little education around what that actually means. Could you, and I just watched this like other this post this it was like on a TikTok feed of this younger like, Gen Z person's like sharing, Google Ads information, and it's like sharing all the profile information about herself. She's like, oh crap, this is like very, very detailed. It's got like 100 different points of information on her. That's happening. And can you share with us, just because we now have some of these things in place, there is no like there's the other part of the component is education, right? Educating the audience at large, like what are you actually signing up, what are you agreeing to do? And because I think it's also like we're such an instant gratification world now, it's like you just click whatever it needs to do to kind of get into it, and they actually make it difficult for you to like not sell your cookie information. They, you know what I mean, like it's a process to kind of like opt out, and that's intentional, I'm sure, for it to make it more of a headache for a UX perspective so that they can collect it. um yeah, I'd be curious as to like your thoughts on just that from a
Yeah, I'd say that yes, it is a instant gratification world, and you're seeing more pushback from the older generations that understand the value of privacy and why this information should be protected, whereas the younger generation that have grown up with tablets and iPads in their hands from when they were a child, they just want it to work. They are using it and not realizing what's happening. TikTok's a great example. Many of them don't feel concerned that every time they use this application, their location data is shared, all their demographic data is shared. They just want to be able to share information. And while you've had big hearings against Meta and Facebook before they changed their name, now you're starting to see that pushback on TikTok. But it's been it's such a revenue generator for small medium-sized businesses that catch on to something going viral on that platform, that you're starting to see mixed reasonings for keeping it or for using it, similar to when Facebook first came out. Everyone wanted to be able to connect with their high school friends from 10 years ago, and this was a platform to go to do that. Now for younger kids, TikTok's the way for them to express themselves. So you're pushing back on it having any limitations on it.
Absolutely, that's a good answer. The next point here I have is going into the topic of AI, which I mean, I think like we had this really like boom phase of things. I think there's been a lot of like overpromising, under delivering still. And but it's definitely going to be what the internet was to us back in the late 90s. I think we're gonna see a similar revelation and similar maybe like cycle of like a boom bust kind of thing, but it's going to stick around forever, and it's going to be game changing, life changing, globally changing. Um, you talk about instant gratification. I think security plays so much in this too, because AI really only, especially the how we see it now, only really works with human interaction involved. At some point, there will be requiring less and less human interaction involved to run the queries to learn from. Uh, but I think that if you don't understand tech, let alone AI, like, and you try to know what it's doing and be on and educate yourself about it, that gap is going to become wider and wider of those that are just non-thinking consumers, and then just like listening to what things like, I think about it this way, which is like, have you ever had a conversation with somebody and they share a factual point, and it's like, yeah, they said this. Well, what is they? The internet said this. Okay, well, we don't have a real viable source here in terms of what you're referencing or sourcing the data from. It's just going to be more looser and looser and looser around that, where we're not going to have a sense of what truth or accuracy or factual statements are. Uh, any thoughts on that, and any um again, like, kind of just like your, maybe you're from your own personal beliefs of like what you think we need to be prepared for, and how we should be thinking about security here the next, I mean, it's happening now, it's in real time, but like today versus like a year from now, 2 years from now, and maybe like how people should educate themselves around it.
Yeah, I think even for us, quote unquote, tech folks, it's hard to understand what AI or machine learning is doing because it's happening so quickly
Yeah.
that even if you went to a course or you went to a seminar on something, 3 months later, it's already grown past that. Um, that's one aspect. The other aspect, when it comes to generative AI, which is what a lot of people think of when they hear AI, which is artificial intelligence generating an image, generating a video, generating a sound, it becomes harder for you to validate that that's something that's happened. In the past, when you saw it on video, you trusted it over just hearing a sound clip. And going back even further, you trusted a sound clip over something written in the newspaper. So similar things are happening, but there's less and less ways to validate that what you're looking at, what you're hearing, what you're seeing is really something that occurred, or was it something that was edited? You had the recent scandal with the royal family where they wanted to put out a picture, but maybe it wasn't the right setting. Maybe that they weren't able to gather everyone together, whatever. The picture was edited, and now you have people going, oh, well, if the royal family is editing pictures and putting them out for real, like, who else is doing this? Well, they've been doing this in the media for years. They've been doing this in print for years. So now we're just starting to see that it's become very easy for someone that you wouldn't think that the royal family is very tech forward, and the fact that someone now can really edit a picture and make it look very realistic, that this is now something in the hands of everyday people, and they can really edit things really quickly. Yes, that's happening. I think when you think a little more deeper about it in regards to machine learning outside of the generative aspect, all the data that we put out there, that we generate, that's there for analysis, if there isn't controls on how these models make decisions, because they were created by humans and therefore they have some bias in them. If that bias isn't checked, you're going to have infringements of rights, you're going to have discriminatory actions. And we've seen this in the past when it came to interest rates, when it came to credit scores, because where you lived, the school you went to, all these things became a factual data point that a bank wanted to put in with regards to how they made a credit decision. This is going to happen faster and faster with everyone being able to do this because they're able to access models and use AI in a much more easier to use fashion than it was that you had to create your own models.
Yeah.
Now there's models that are out there that run on a USB device that's really tiny, a Raspberry Pi, that can make decisions that people didn't think of before that.
Yeah. It's a Pandora's box of things, right? Like, I mean, I try and even think about unless we get on top of, and I don't know if it's art. Maybe this is a question for you, but like, I don't know if it's already gotten so fast and evolving where I think about just kind of, especially generative AI. If you don't have something secure, like policing that or uh, checking for if it's generated, from AI versus factual or truthful. I mean, we're just going to be digesting a bunch of things that we have no idea of where the source of it actually came from. And
Yeah, I think there's a difference between being generated by artificial intelligence, but still being factually true,
yeah,
versus being generated by artificial intelligence and being obviously false.
yeah,
I think it's that distinction between misinformation and real information that we really need to worry about. And that's where the line really gets blurry
yeah,
because people using it to generate new content or new text or something new aren't checking that there's the bias in there or that the information's correct. It's just being generated and spit out versus in the past where it might have been generated, fact checked by an editorial team, and then put out there. Or you have the models validated for bias, for non discriminatory actions, things like that. Today, it's moving so fast that sure, Congress is putting in actions that are coming down the pipeline where you're going to say, okay, if your AI is being used in, say, national defense, we want to see how your model is being created. We want to see what's happening under the box. But if it's just being used for image generation for non-security reasons, then we might be less concerned. Or if the processing power is at a certain level, you have to register that model with the government because it has the processing power to really do national security harm.
yeah,
Then they're concerned about it.
yeah. Still to be determined, though, right? It's a lot of this is still up in the air, which is the crazy thing, especially how fast things are moving. Um, that we're up on time. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time today. Very insightful. Thank you for entertaining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge in the space. I think it was very, very useful, very beneficial to our listeners. So I just want to say, yeah, thank you for carving out the time.
Thank you for having me on. It's a fun conversation, and I
Yeah,
love to have great conversations.
absolutely. Thank you.